Okay, we continue with holiday task 2. Three ultimately separate topics that have been combined here in the topic companion, and I think it makes sense for us to combine them as well, because for some of them there's not that much to say. So ethics, peer review, and implications of research for the economy. Yep, there's a full specification, but you've got it in the topic companion anyway. So ethics, we've talked a lot about ethics, certainly in the social influence topic that you did at the start of the year. A lot of ethical issues to be considered there, but you just need to bear in mind that ethics always has to be considered, even if a study seems fairly routine and mundane. Ethics still need to be considered. I usually liken this to risk assessments. And I complete a risk assessment for my classroom, even though it's a bog standard classroom. Like, yeah, there's tables and chairs. We still have to have a risk assessment. You still have to consider risk, even if there really doesn't seem to be any. So ethics are always there. Any research would need to be ethically sound before it could be going ahead. Now, the BPS, British Psychological Society, all you need to know is they publish the ethical guidelines in this country for us to follow. Of course, there'll be equivalents in other countries as well. I've given you the link here. I'm not suggesting by any means that you read every word of it, but maybe it's worth opening it and just having a glance so you can see what you mean. So if you see BPS Code of Ethics, don't panic. It's just the guidelines that we follow in this country when it comes to the ethics for psychological research. So we've used these many times. Deception, right to withdraw, informed consent, privacy and confidentiality, and protection from harm, be that physical or psychological. In the exam topic companion, they talk about DRIP as a way of remembering these. Might be a useful one. Just think of me. Right, so deception. This is when you knowingly withhold information or mislead a participant. Why is this a problem? Well, ultimately, if they've been deceived, then they haven't given their fully informed consent, which we'll come to in a bit. They should be given their fully informed consent. They should know exactly what they're signing up to. If there's been some deception, then they haven't. Think Milgram as an example. Completely false aim was given in that study. How do you overcome this? Read questions carefully. Is it saying, what does the issue mean? Is it asking you, why is it an issue? Or is it asking, what can you do about it? So on these slides, the last bit, and in the topic companion, the last bit is, what can you do about it? Now, yes, ideally deception should be avoided, but it is necessary, as I say. Otherwise, a lot of studies just wouldn't work. If Milgram study or ASH or any of those older ones, if people knew exactly what was going on, it doesn't happen, it can't work. So it is required a lot of the time, but there's still things you can do about it. So if you provide a full debrief at the end of the study, crucially giving the true aim, so they then know the full nature of the study, then they can give their they can enforce their right to withdraw at that time. Now, that doesn't necessarily solve every problem. They might be pretty miffed that they've been misled. It could be that they've behaved in a way that they feel uncomfortable with, and if they'd known what this was really about, then they wouldn't have done it. So again, I know it's a dated example, but Milgram study, those people came out there thinking, I thought I was killing someone, and they didn't know what they were signing up for. So yes, that's one way of addressing it. Certainly a full debrief, give the full aims, but it doesn't mean that it's not a problem. Right to withdraw. Participants should have the right to withdraw, or have to have the right to withdraw at any time during the study without any negative consequences. It's worth adding that in there. Okay, so even if it seems like it's going to be a huge inconvenience, then they have the right to withdraw their data, even retrospectively, say, actually, I don't want that data to be included anymore. Participants might experience stress if they feel that they can't stop. So if you're not if you start to feel uncomfortable with what you're doing, and I've probably mentioned before, I've taken part in even just questionnaires at university. It's really sensitive stuff. Some people might think, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realise quite how deep this was going to get. I don't want to do this. Now, if they don't feel they have the right to stop, that puts stress on them, and then we're not protecting them from harm. Sorry about the screaming. Yeah, it is important that they are reminded before the study starts that they have the right to withdraw. During the study, particularly if, as a experimenter, you can see that they're becoming upset or distressed, you should be saying to them that please remember you do have the right to stop if you feel you need to. And of course, some of those controversial old social studies certainly didn't do that. It's essential that you continue. Okay, and even afterwards that they have the right to withdraw as well. So making sure that's always there as an available option to them. Informed consent, we've mentioned this already. Participants should know exactly what they're signing up to before it. So the overall nature of the study, what they're going to be asked to do, the duration of the study, all of that should be given up front. We will look at consent forms and you might be asked to write a basic consent form. I don't want to do that now, we'll do that when we're back together. But ultimately you just have to think, what would somebody need to know to completely understand what they're signing up for? Why is it important? Well, because of what we talked about. People might not have signed up for something. If they knew the true nature of something, the full nature of something, they might not sign up for it. So it's important that people really know what they're doing. I haven't done one recently, but if you get stopped by one of those researchers in the high street, the clipboards and that, they'll always, oh, it'll only take 5 minutes, it'll only take 10 minutes. And you say, okay, then I give my consent to do something that only takes 5 or 10 minutes. You're sitting in there, suddenly they're doing all these different things. You hold on a second, this is nearly half an hour. I wouldn't have said yes to this. So that's an example where actually that wasn't fully informed consent. So participants should know exactly what they're signing up to. Now, if, this is where it ties in with deception, if deception is going to be used, then ultimately those participants can't give their fully informed consent. So how can you get around that? 3 different ways here. Presumptive consent, you can find a different random sample from the population. You can give them the full nature of the study and see whether they would be happy to do that study given what it actually really involves. How would they feel about being deceived? All of that. Now, if they're saying, yes, actually, I think I'd be okay with that, then you can presume that others would feel that way as well. Or prior general consent, if you can get the participant to give their consent to a series of studies, and if within that you say this may include studies where an element of deception is used, then you've got their consent. Sounds a bit sinister, but it is another way of doing it, so that they have actually given their consent to take part in studies where they might not actually know really what they're doing. And then probably the most straightforward one is retrospective consent. So if you've used deception, once they've done the study, once you've got the data, then you can tell them the full aims and everything. And then at that point, you can get their consent to be part of it. Okay, and if they don't like the true aims, then they're not. Another thing to bear in mind, do watch out for this, it does come up in questions sometimes. Children, anybody under 16, as with school trips and things like that, is parental consent that would be required, so do watch out for that one. We've got privacy and confidentiality. Privacy is people knowing how information about them will be communicated with others. There will be things that you might want to be private. There might be things that you're happy to say. Now, potentially a researcher could end up getting more from you than you actually intended. It could be argued that that's become more of an invasion of privacy if they've started to address very sensitive things and you've sort of gone with it and then asked us, oh, wait, I wish I hadn't said that. So protecting privacy, this will tie in with a lot of the things we've talked about. Informed consent, knowing exactly what you're going to be talking about here. The right to withdraw, so if somebody's said that they're happy to discuss relationships, but then it started to get a bit too sensitive and detailed and intimate, then reminding them that they can stop there. And then it does tie in with the next one, confidentiality. So ultimately, making sure that people can't be identified from their data is under the Data Protection Act, GDPR, all that fun and games that we have with us nowadays. Psychological research is part of that. So how's the data going to be stored? How's it going to be used, etc., etc. And the most obvious thing to say with this is to make sure that people can't be identified from their data. So don't go slapping their name at the top of it, or any personal address or details or place of work, organisation, or anything like that. You can have false names. A lot of the ones I did, I had codes that wouldn't mean a thing to anybody else if they found it. So yeah, confidentiality, just bear in mind, make sure that the participants can't be identified from the data. Protection from harm, physical harm and psychological harm. Risks for either shouldn't be any greater than they would be during everyday life. So we're not saying that the research has to be a complete stress-free zone or anything like that. People experience a certain level of anxiety in everyday life, so that's okay, but it shouldn't really be going beyond that. And certainly they should be leaving your study in the same state as they came in, be that physically. If they got 2 arms, they should leave with 2 arms. That'd be extreme. If they were happy when they came, they should leave happy. Okay, so you've got to make sure that's the case. So how do you do this? Well, obviously for physical harm, you just got this risk assessment, really thinking, could there potentially be anything here? Stopping the study if you think, oh, actually, there's a greater risk to harm to the participants here than I thought. I suppose going back to the old studies, Zimbardo's prison study, maybe got a bit more lively than they expected. You could have a similar situation where it needs to be stopped. Right to withdraw, particularly with the psychological harm. If they're becoming very distressed, then reminding them they can stop. Remember, psychological harm isn't like it's screwed you up for the rest of your life necessarily. We're talking about a high level of anxiety at that time. That's enough to be questionable for psychological harm. Okay, and of course the full debrief at the end, offer of additional support if it's required, counselling. Please think about the nature of the study. I have had offers of counselling in the most mundane, routine memory studies and things like that. It's not an issue. Okay, so please think, is it really the kind of topic that could lead to people experiencing distress, could potentially lead to them remembering things from early life or delicate personal topics? Just think about the nature of the study when you're choosing your ethical issues to focus on. Okay, so that's ethics. So then the second one is peer review. And this is, all those names and years that we talk about, those are articles that have been published in psychological journals, published on a quarterly basis, maybe monthly, and people want their research to be published. They want to tell the world about their research. But the editors of these journals won't just publish anything. They need to know that it's good quality research. They don't want to be embarrassed. The worst possible thing for a journal is having to retract, go right back on a something they published and say, actually, we shouldn't have published this. The most well-known ones probably the MMR triple vaccine, and the Lancet, one of the most prestigious medical journals, published this research calling into question the safety of this triple jab linking to autism, I think, and later had to retract it, and it's had a massive negative impact on many things. So they don't want that to happen. So hopefully peer review will stop that, in theory, although all of that was peer reviewed, so it didn't work. Right, so what is it all about? So a form of quality control. Research is assessed by independent experts in the same field, and they will give their view to the journal editor of whether this research is worthy of publication, whether it's potentially worthy of publication but needing amendments, or whether it should be rejected. So the process: you as a researcher submit your paper to the journal, whichever one you think is most applicable for your research. Some of them are very specific areas of psychology, some are quite broad. The editor will pass it to the peer reviewers to have a look at it. These peer reviewers will be other academics, other researchers working in the same sort of field. They will give their feedback to the editor, and then the editor will feed back to you saying what's going to happen. Okay, so that's what it's for, and that's the process. You might be asked about the purpose of this. Well, the key thing is to maintain that quality, to make make sure it's only good quality research that is going to be published. It will check the validity of the research. Is it measuring what it claims to be measuring? The reliability of it. Is it going to be consistent in terms of the measures that have been used? Is the methodology appropriate, or does it raise too many questions about that will link in with validity? Is it significant? I mean, does it serve a purpose? It should be meaningful, particularly for these journal editors. They want to be publishing important stuff here. If you're looking at some obscure research, yeah, fine, methodology might be fine and validity might be fine, but is it really important? Does it serve a purpose? That's another thing. Originality, making sure you're not going to publish something that's already been done before. And yeah, to maintain the integrity of psychological research, you want psychological research to have a good name for the sake of future people wanting to participate in psychological research, for the allocation of funding for psychological research as well. So you don't want anything dodgy basically linked to psychological research. And yeah, when it comes to funding, where people from institutions have had a number of peer-reviewed articles published, then you know that they are a fairly safe bet for future funding. So if the government is trying to think, oh, okay, we need to allocate some funding here, then the people who've got multiple peer-reviewed publications, they're probably going to attract that funding rather than taking a risk with an institution or individuals who haven't. Okay, so it does serve many different purposes, but the main thing is maintaining that standard, making sure it's good quality research that is being published. That's really the main positive of it. Making sure that it's good quality, making sure that it's original, making sure it's not plagiarized and ripped off somebody else's work. It's going to be flagged up. If other experts in the same field are looking at it, they're going to recognise it. Hold on, this is my work, or they'll know it well. So that's the main thing. But there are some negatives here. The reviewers are anonymous, and they are ultimately rivals in the same field. So imagine if you've been working away for years on something, and suddenly somebody else has done the work that sort of beats you to it almost, and it comes to you to decide whether that's fit for publication. It's going to be very tempting to try and slow it down a bit, to maybe try and pick it to pieces. It ties in with funding. Funding is limited. Times are hard. So if you giving this a glowing review means that future funding could be directed to a rival, then that's going to be very tempting to slow it down. You'd hope it's not the case, but it could be. Okay, so that's an issue, that because they're anonymous, this could happen. Also, it does require another expert in the same field. There might not be an equivalent appropriate expert in the same field. This could be groundbreaking new stuff here, where the person doing the research is the expert. Anybody else is not at the same level. So if somebody's looking at it and they haven't got the same level of expertise, they might not pick up on issues that need to be picked up on. So it could lead to stuff being published that actually shouldn't have been, because there's issues, but people ultimately didn't recognise that because they didn't have the equivalent level of knowledge. Now, there's the other broad issue, publication bias. It's just something to be aware of. There is a bias towards positive findings. Researchers are more likely to submit positive findings. When you think, oh yeah, there's no significant link, it takes away the motivation to get things published. Editors are more likely to go for positive. Oh yeah, link between this and this. That's more interesting. Okay, so there tends to be a bias towards publication to positive findings. And also there can be a bias towards findings that are in keeping with what's gone before. So when people are doing the peer review process, if a paper comes along that goes against the generally agreed idea of how things work, then people could be more critical of a paper that goes against it. So publication bias is just something to be aware of. There can be a bias, particularly towards positive findings, but also towards findings that maintain the status quo, is what they say, and people being more picky when it doesn't. Now, this one always scares students, but I don't think it should. Implications of psychological research for the economy. So I've took a definition off from online, not psychological, just generally. The state of a country or region in terms of the production and consumption of goods and services and the supply of money. So with the current pandemic, the economy has been a big issue. You've got lots of businesses closed. You've got the government finding the magic money tree and chucking billions everywhere. So it's going to have huge implications for the economy, for businesses, for people's income, for people's spending, for the health services, for everything. Okay, so that's the economy. We're just saying, well, how could psychological research have implications for the economy? Now, there's lots of different ways this could happen, but here's a few examples that pretty much tie in with the examples in your booklet. So it could be research into treatments, into therapies. It could find that drugs are more effective. They might be cheaper. They might find that psychological therapies are much more effective, but would be more expensive. So implications for the economy there. The speed at which they work would have implications, because you might be able to get people back to work quicker. Earning money, paying taxes, having money to spend, and all of that. So it could also reduce the risk of relapse. So psychological research could mean that people, once they get over the condition or get it managed, then are less likely to have a relapse. So they'll continue being at work. So that's one thing. You could use the example of the cognitive interview, making court processes, police work more efficient. If you have wrongful arrest, or worst of all, somebody's been locked up for ages, like was the case in many occasions when Loftus was motivated to do her research, that's a lot of time and money that's gone into sending that person to prison, maintaining them in prison. You've probably got huge compensation for it. So potentially psychological research into the cognitive interview could reduce wasted public money. Okay, and then another one that did actually come up in an exam, for the birth of a child, the leave that people have, so maternal leave, paternal leave, the role of the fathers in attachment. It was certainly my day 2 weeks paternity leave. I think it still is, but there's a question of the psychological research says that the role of the father is much more substantial in a child's development than was previously thought. Then that could have implications. Bowlby's theory, I think we talked about this already, suggested that maybe it'd have a negative impact if the mother was to return to work too soon and break that bond, interrupt that attachment. So that's again another example. There's probably many other examples as well. Just that would have implications, because obviously the people will be not at work. They'll be receiving potentially benefits from the government, or employers might be paying a certain amount. It might reduce their earnings for a period and therefore reduce the amount that they're spending in shops, etc., etc. Okay, so there's lots of different angles. That's just the kind of things you need to bear in mind. Okay, so there's some examples there.